Oh, hello, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, our Sunday streaming edition of such. Hopefully you can hear me. The thingy looks a bit different, but who knows? Who cares? For me, c'est la vie, good song. So today I want to talk all about Playboy, but don't worry, we are not going to get ourselves banned from YouTube over those images. If anything, we'll get banned from YouTube over the commentary. So also subscribe to my X because I put all of my videos on there as well. So why are we talking about Playboy on a music program? Well, because Playboy and music have been intertwined since just about the beginning. And it's very certain styles of music in particular that have been associated with the brand Playboy. So let's start from the beginning. Selling sex is the oldest profession in the world, as they like to say. And Hugh Hefner with Playboy attempted to take sex into the mainstream. And he did it in a very, from a marketing point of view, clever way. Some could say from a sociological point of view, devious sort of way, but it's a fine line, just as the line between love and hate is thus. And the method of public relations that Hugh Hefner used to sell sex was by making it into something sophisticated. So this was, far removed from, two kids looking at the elephants doing it in the zoo. This was about wrapping sex in the veneer of Cadillacs and martinis and Swiss watches and all of that type of stuff. And of course, every social movement that you can dress up to or dress down to requires a soundtrack. And early on in the magazine, a lot of musicians, particularly from the world of jazz, were given a spotlight by Playboy. And whatever you think of Playboy's sociological effects, and a lot of people from the cultural mainstream of the 50s thought that the influence was uniformly negative by pushing, lurid ideas into people's homes. They thought this is smut, this is degenerate. And I'm not going to comment on that one way or the other because I trust you to decide for yourselves. But what I will say is that musically, the Playboy magazine did actually give a spotlight to artists that weren't necessarily given that sort of spotlit treatment. Now, it is true that in the 50s, jazz was closer to the mainstream than it became in subsequent decades. Steve Allen loved jazz and had many great jazz musicians on, as did other shows, but Playboy was very unique in both promoting the albums and putting the spotlight on the musicians who were given an opportunity through written interviews to speak for themselves. Now, when it comes to the audio and visual, that's what I really want to focus on because in 1959, Playboy began producing a television show called Playboy's Penthouse. Now, it was never a national show on the networks. It was syndicated, on the networks, but it wasn't network produced. And it was only shown in certain markets, typically urban markets, because the idea of putting anything Playboy related on television was still too hot for most television. Now, the show isn't what some of the youngsters out there might think. There was no, stripping or anything like that. The bunnies were there, but they were clothed. But what it really was an opportunity to reinvent the talk show in a casual setting. And in this way, it almost prefigured the IRL stream or reality TV. It was done in a television studio in Chicago, but it was designed to look like a glamorous penthouse. There was a real bar. All of the guests were celebrities that they were drinking, mingling with each other, mingling with the bunnies, mingling with people who were there to, dance and add color. And what was really interesting was the quality of the musicians that Hefner had on. And he allowed them to play multiple pieces of music per episode. He interviewed them in this casual setting. And I think what a lot of people at the time liked about the show is that Hefner's on screen personality was quite disarming. He was very understated, and at times he could even be quite wooden, which I guess if you're in Playboy, being wooden isn't necessarily a bad thing. They're going to so ban me one of these days. Free speech, free speech, free speech. Anyway, I just want to read you a list that I compiled of some of the musicians on the original episodes of Playboy's Penthouse, because there were some really good musicians. Some who were emerging and never really got big were featured, but there were also some people that were big and remain very important in music history and to music lovers. So, on the first episode, you had the great songwriter and pianist Cy Coleman. Everyone sung his songs, and he wrote the instrumental theme song to Playboy's Penthouse, which is, in my view, a really hot, really good piece of music. And also on that show were Ella Fitzgerald and Nat King Cole. So you're starting out with the heavy hitters. Um, just reading on through the list, you had Larry Kent, who was quite well known on Broadway at the time. You had the vocal jazz trio of Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, not Jimi Hendrix, that is, Bud and Travis, two folk singers. Then on the third episode, you had one of my very favorite musicians of all time, Ahmad Jamal, and his trio, one of the very finest pianists of all times. You also had Earl Hines rather on that episode. I'm gonna go rather quickly, so I'm not necessarily going to go in order. But looking at some of the other episodes, you had Joe Williams, great vocalist, someone who Johnny Carson loved a lot. You had the Count Basie band, Count Basie, an absolute legend. You had Sarah Vaughan, absolute titan of female pop and jazz vocals. Cal Tadger, wonderful, wonderful musician. On the folky side of things, it wasn't all jazz. There was definitely an emphasis on jazz, but I don't mean to imply it was all, because you had a lot of variety. You had Pete Seeger, the famous folk singer. Stan Kenton, wonderful, wonderful musician. Laureen Hunter, Jeffrey Holder, Dave Allen, the Eddie Higgins Quartet, really like them. Dakota Staten, absolutely great. You had Nina Simone, one of the finest vocalists and pianists of all time. And on that episode, she both sung and played piano. You also, on that same episode, had the Mellow Larks. Jerry Southern, great singer. Larry Older, a wonderful harmonicist. Is that what we say? I believe so. Ahmad Jamal came back, which is a wonderful thing, because again, check him out. Absolutely amazing. Anne Henry, Beverly Keeney, Will Holt again, Susan Johnson, Kai Winding, Dick Hames, Fran Jeffries, Larry Kent again, or Kurt rather, again, Josh White, Monique Van Vuren, very good singer, not as famous as she ought to be. Carmen McRae, absolutely great. Dizzy Gillespie, one of the founders of early bebop, and in that sense, one of the founders of the modern style of jazz itself. Count Basie came back for a second show, as did Joe Williams, the great crooner Tony Bennett. You had Anita O'Day, wonderful, wonderful vocalist. Mabel Mercer, a vocal group called The Signatures. Clancy Hayes of the vocal group The Vagabonds. The Limelighters, another vocal group. Woody Herman, a throwback to the age of the big band. The great guitarist Charlie Byrd. The Four Freshmen, now we're into April of 1960. The Four Freshmen had been around since the 40s, and they were Brian Wilson's main influence when he formed the Beach Boys, and he said so many times. Pete Seeger and Tony Bennett also came back for that episode. Then the show was about to end, but have said, I don't want to end it before getting the one guest I've really wanted all this time. And so he got him, and that was, of course, Sammy Davis Jr., because how can you have Playboy's Penthouse without Sammy Davis Jr.? And then on the final two episodes, you also had Dave Brubeck. They did Take Five and Blue Rondo While It Took, probably Dave Brubeck's most famous compositions. You had Ray Charles, and you had Gene Krupa, one of the absolute, I've actually done a video on him. I think I'm going to do another soon. The founder of modern drumming, and just really, really great stuff. And so then you had the show go off air. It was an interesting experiment. The people loved it, really loved it, but it never really caught fire the way that the magazine did. And why? Well, because the people kept their clothes on. But the musicians that were featured, yes, a lot of these musicians would have also been featured on the Steve Allen shows and the Jack Parr shows of the day, but and and the Ed Sullivans and the Sid Caesars, but there was just something different about seeing them in this ultra casual environment, which really hadn't been tried on television. Everything on television was very showy, like the Tonight Show. There would be a format, there would be comedy routines, there would be welcome to the show type of announcements, where this was just, a sort of camera on a track panning throughout this fake penthouse in a TV studio where the bands would interact with comedians and actors, and comedians would do their set, magicians would perform card tricks, and Hugh Hefner looked amazed as he smoked on his pipe. And it was objectively a very interesting show, whether or not you like or care for the realities or the legacy of the Playboy brand. And this ran from 1959 to very early 1961. 10 years later, the show was back, only this time it was being filmed in LA and it changed names. Now it was called Playboy After Dark, but it was the exact same format, the same theme song by Cy Coleman. The only real difference was slight difference in the set, but barely. And it was in color rather than black and white. But it was basically the same format, and there were even more musical guests this time around than there were earlier on. And one of the really interesting things is that by the time you get to the late 60s, early 70s, because this ran from 69 to I think very early 71, it was an era of transition in music. The classic pop, so called, or traditional pop, as some call it, stars that emerged anytime from the 30s to the very early 60s, they were still relatively young or on the young side of middle age, and they were happening. But there was a younger generation with sort of teenaged and 20 something musicians that were creating new genres. There were rock and its derivatives, the modern generation of singer-songwriters, the new generation of soul and R&B singers. And Playboy After Dark allowed them to mingle with each other, because not only were they all there playing their music, but they were having a drink and talking to the girls and watching the comedians do their stand-up and so forth. So it was really an interesting show that brought together in the same room at the same time the musicians of the classic pop generation with the musicians of the younger rock and roll generation. And I just want to read you some of the musicians that participated in this. So in one of the early episodes, you had Iron Butterfly, I think in Agata Davida. You had Bill Medley of the Righteous Brothers. You had Tony Bennett back from the first show. You also had Morgana King. You had Steppenwolf, Born to Be Wild. You had Della Reese. You had one of my favorite singers of all time, who was a frequent guest, Vic Damone, absolutely one of my favorites. The Brothers Castro, Harry Nilsson, up and coming songwriter of the time, as was Buffy St. Marie. You had the very soulful, very funky Buddy Miles Express. Wonderful stuff. You had the Avant-Garde. You had Joan Baez. You had, coming back for more from the first time around, Sammy Davis Jr. You had a rock group that never really made it big, pardon me, called The College. You had a group that made it very big, albeit in a certain circle, The Grateful Dead. You had Three Dog Night, the Pickle Brothers. You had Taj Mahal, the great R&B blues guitarist, the great Jackie DeShannon, Buddy Rich, one of the great drummers of all time, Joe Williams coming back around, the James Cotton Blues Band, very good stuff there. Lou Rawls, great singer. Buddy Miles back again. James Brown, the James Brown. Three Dog Night came back. Pete Seeger from the first time around. Carmen McRae again from the first time around. Canned Heat, Buddy Greco. The Byrds, To Everything Turn, Turn, Turn. Marvin Gaye, the great Marvin Gaye. The Grassroots, big band at the time. The Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, also quite big. Lou Rawls back again. The Sir Douglas Quintet, a rock band that became something of a cult favorite. The Clara Ward Singers. The great Johnny Mathis, the Chambers brothers. I really love the Chambers brothers. I've done videos about them. Time Has Come Today is probably their biggest hit, but they had some great stuff. Joe Williams back again. Steppenwolf back again. Bretton Wood, a great singer who I've done a video on. We lost him, I think, just a few months back. Deep Purple, and it was really the only that I'm aware of, the only video footage of the Mark One Deep Purple. The one with Nick Semper and Rod Evans, Hush being their biggest hit. They did that. Richie Blackmore, John Lord, Ian Pace, and all they were there. Moving forward, now we're into 1970. Joe Cocker, I love Joe Cocker. Who doesn't? Linda Ronstadt, a young up-and-coming Linda Ronstadt. Sweetwater, the band that they made that movie about, but they were a real band. Carla Thomas, Canned Heat, Sonny and Cher, Vic Damone again, Tony Bennett again, Joe Williams again, Grand Funk Railroad when they were just getting going. Love Grand Funk. The Cannonball Adderley Quintet. Cannonball Adderley, one of the great jazz musicians. Doug Kershaw, Ike and Tina Turner. I know. Wonderful, but Ike. The Nitty Gritty Dirt Band were back. Steppenwolf back again. Dolores Hall, James Brown again. The Chambers Brothers again. Jack Jones again. Fleetwood Mac, one of their early iterations. I believe it was either just before or just after Peter Green left the band. I'm going to need to rewatch that video. Leslie Gore had so many hits at that time. The great Smokey Robinson. Frankie Randall, the Modern Jazz Quartet, the Grassroots, the great soul jazz of Les McCann. Sarah Vaughan came back, Carmen McRae again, B.B. King, the Blues King, Country Joe and the Fish, Linda Ronstadt again, Sammy Davis again, Billy Preston again, the Cowsills, who had some hits at the time. I'm sure that I've missed a few, but I think you can sort of get the idea. There were a lot of very interesting people, and they were interacting with the comedians of the day. I mean, Lenny Bruce was on the show, Sid Caesar was on the show, Steve Allen was on the show, Bill Cosby was on the show, insert your jokes here. And they were all sort of mingling and interacting. And again, the show didn't last for that long. It ended in 1970, not 71. I'm just looking now. But again, it was this second iteration of this Playboy on TV. It brought together, as you can hopefully see from the list, the best of the old, or not that old, but the best of the people who were catering to people in their 30s or above, with the musicians who at the time were catering to the teens and people in their 20s. And if you were living in a market that was fortunate, I'll say, enough to have this in syndication, you would have had a pretty good time. Now, why didn't it continue? Well, Playboy has always been a company whose fortunes ebbed and flowed. It was in and out of fashion at various times. In the 50s, it was very sophisticated but a bit taboo. By the 70s, it had almost become part and parcel of a let it all hang out culture. And by the 80s, while still relatively popular, it was now competing with a much more raunchy idea of commodified sex that was less about sipping a martini in the backseat of a Cadillac limo while wearing a Rolex, but more about quaaludes in the restroom of a local Chevron station, where you have your Chevy Nova running out in front. And so, well, what made me think of this? Well, I just read that Playboy, or what's left of the company, is deciding to relocate from LA to Miami because of Gavin Newsom. That's literally what they said. Don't censor me, folks. Not that I really care. I'm on X. But anyway, why must we take any of this seriously? And that made me think of the legacy of the company, which, like I said, it's a mixed bag in terms of the sociology. When it came, the cultural center and right didn't like it because of so-called debauchery and degeneracy. And then at the turn of the 21st century, many of those same arguments were used, but this time from a progressive feminist point of view, saying, well, you are commodifying sex, but it's bad, uniquely bad for women rather than sort of bad for society as a whole. all. And then there was this interim period, late 60s, 70s, early 80s, where everyone was letting it all hang out. And so make of that what you will. The music interviews in the magazine were a constant long before and after these two television shows. But I just find the format, forgetting the fact that it's Playboy, I find the casual format of these television shows very, very interesting because being casual on camera was very novel in the 50s, and it remained somewhat novel in the late 60s, early 70s as well. Now everything's casual. I mean, I don't have a set, I don't even have a good camera, and here I am because the modern world is all about authenticity. And in his own way, Hefner with these shows did produce authentic interactions, and most importantly for someone like me, it produced some great shows. I was watching one the other night where you had Sue Rainey, a great vocalist. You had Vic Damone. You had Buddy Rich. Just really great stuff. And then the next minute, I was watching the one with Steppenwolf, and then the Grateful Dead. Just a lot of interesting variety. And most of these have found their way to YouTube, not in an official capacity, but they've been uploaded by the fans. So, yeah, check it out. I think that you'll find the musical performances incredibly interesting. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.